The fourth file indexed here at the Cryptic archive has become a topic of all-consuming depth and intrigue for me. Hours have turned into days and days into weeks as I've found and researched each new bloody breadcrumb. Let me introduce to you entry number 0004, The Vampire. I'm sure everyone knows what a vampire is, whether it's from the familiarity of seeing a child dressed up as one for Halloween, wearing a pair of bloody fangs, or from watching their favorite movie. Vampires have been incredibly prevalent in the media over the years, from classics like Bram Stoker's Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, Blade, or heck, even newer movies like Twilight. There has been no shortage of vampire TV shows either, with True Blood and Vampire Diaries. Even anime has thrown in with Vampire Hunter D and Hellsing. This is just some of the media I've sampled over my lifetime, and I'm sure there are a ton more that I haven't even mentioned here. Still, movies might not be the best medium to convey what a vampire actually is, but it at least instills us with the basics. So, what exactly is a vampire? Where did the legend come from, and how would you know if you'd encountered one, besides maybe having 2 fresh new fang wounds on your neck? Believe it or not, answering that question is a lot more complicated than it sounds. There is no simple answer to it. The vampire mythos is complicated and difficult to follow unless you're a relentless bloodhound. No pun intended. But I've hunted this prey thoroughly, and I think by now I'm comfortable enough to attempt a basic explanation. But instead of starting from the beginning chronologically, I think it makes more sense to start from what we know now in the present day and trace it back to its roots. Vampires are said to be ageless, or stuck in the age they were turned at. They all drink blood in one way or another, most commonly by puncturing their victim's skin with their fangs. They have superhuman strength, and often that's accompanied by speed as well. Some have the power of persuasion, often called the charm, and are able to sway their victims' thoughts just by looking into their eyes. Some can turn into mist, some can turn into a bat, or swarms of bats, and some even appear to fly. But the vampires we see today in film were derived mostly from fictional literature. I mentioned it earlier, but I'm sure everyone has heard of Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? It was published in 1897, and many believe the character Count Dracula was based on a real-life person, Vlad Tepes, or more commonly known as Vlad the Impaler. He was the ruler of Wallachia in the 1400s and is considered a national hero of Romania. His life story is intensely interesting, and for that reason I will most certainly be covering him in a separate video too. But suffice it to say, even though he's become a famous historical figure for his brutal acts, the only real vampiric sounding trait he had was mentioned in a poem by Michael Bayham, who wrote the story of a bloodthirsty madman called Dracula of Wallachia. In the ballad, he suggests that Dracula dined among his impaled victims, even being accused of dipping his bread in their blood. Still, some have said that this very connection was completely fabricated. One Elizabeth Miller, who co-authored an article in Journal of Dracula Studies, argues that it was a remarkably liberal translation of the German it was originally written in. These are the lines of the poem, which would have been sung, think like a bard. And here's what Miller says the accurate translation would be. As you can see, it depicts him washing his hands in blood. Still, who's to say what that actually means? It could mean that his hands were bloodied when he sat down to eat, or it could mean that they actually brought a bowl of blood to the table that he drenched his hands in before he ate. This article talks about the translation issue in depth, and I'll link it down below if you're interested in reading more about it. But if this ballad was the big connection to Vlad being a living vampire that ingested blood, well, this argument kind of sullies that notion. It's also said that Stoker took additional influence from an article written by Emily Gerard about Transylvanian superstitions too, which explains how the territories Dracula governed changed, since Transylvania is right next to Wallachia on the map, but Vlad did not rule it. In fact, he's said to have attacked it quite often. There are many other books besides Dracula that helped to shape the image of the modern vampire too, like The Vampire Tale in 1819 by Joan Polidor, Carmilla in 1872 by Sheridan Le Fanu, and Family of the Vourdalak by Alexei Tolstoy. Please keep an eye out for future videos where I plan to go over these novels in detail. But long before these books were written, there were stories of blood-sucking creatures already circulating, and that literature is said to be taken from local legends. And that's where it gets complicated, because while vampire is the word we hear most commonly used in the United States, in actuality, this creature is very different from region to region and has various names and behaviors. And what's even more interesting is that even though vampires and werewolves are usually considered at odds in current popular literature, in the past they were usually linked. People in the Ukraine even thought that vampires were men who used to be werewolves. The word Varkolac came from Romania and meant both lunar eclipse and a wolf demon, or a witch that could turn into a wolf. It was said to stay in its tomb for 7 years and would then leave in the form of a small child and suck the blood of human beings. It would keep returning to its victims over the course of several weeks or months, and once it made 9 visits, successfully sucking blood each time, its victim would die within a few days. Interestingly enough, Bram Stoker used this very detail when Dracula visited Lucy Westenra 9 times to suck her blood, and she only survived because of blood transfusions. There was even a part in the movie, if you remember, where Dracula turned into a hairy bipedal creature when he attacks Lucy in the garden. There is the term Vourdalak, sometimes called Werewolves, which comes from Russia. It was also used by the author Tolstoy in the book Family of the Vourdalak that I mentioned earlier. According to Slavic folklore, Vourdalaks are dead bodies that come back to life and suck the blood of live humans. So they're very much like other vampires, but in this case, they're said to prefer the blood of their relatives, the people closest to them in life. And once the victims die, they come back to live as a Vourdalak themselves. Upyr is also a common name for the vampire in Russia. Considering how large the country is, it's not surprising that there would be multiple myths. It was said to be a corpse reanimated by a malicious soul. The Upyr would drink the blood of the children in a family and then move on to the parents. It's said to have iron teeth that it uses to chew itself out of the frozen earth or other obstacles in its path. They were blamed for bad harvests, plagues, and sick livestock. To get rid of an Upyr, you would have to stake it in the heart, or in other Slavic stories, you must decapitate it and bury the head between the feet. Burning them is always considered a good option too. Another name used for vampires, Nosferat, was made popular by the 1922 silent German film Nosferatu, but the director combined different figures from Romanian folklore to create the image of his vampire. He took from the Murony of Wallachia and the Strigoi, which are creatures I'm sure many haven't heard of before. The Murony was said to be the bastard child of 2 illegitimate children, or the dead spirit of someone killed by a vampire. Characteristic-wise, it slept in its grave all day and at night sucked the blood of humans. They were immortal and could only be destroyed by a stake driven through the heart and a needle in its forehead. It was also said to be able to transform into other creatures like a dog, cat, frog, or even a spider. Then you have the Strigoi, which come in 2 different varieties. One is a living witch, usually female, with the added feminine connotation making it Strigoica. And there is also a dead version of the Strigoi, which appears more like a zombie, sometimes called a revenant. It was usually a corpse that did not rot, staying exactly as they had appeared in life after death. They were said to have red eyes, long sharp fingernails, and big mouths. Going back to the cross-linking of vampires and werewolves, they were also said to be quite hairy, some even having tails as well. Like the Russian Upyr, they spread pestilence like cholera in their wake and diseases that killed livestock herds. They ate the hearts of animals and mankind alike, sucking their blood and draining the life from their relatives. The Strigoi were said to amass on St. Andrew's Night, November 30th, a night all locals would be prepared for, lest they die a most unpleasant death. Once morning came, the Strigoi were said to burst into pieces, sounding much like the modern idea of a vampire turning to dust in the sunlight. Then, there are other less discussed vampire legends from other parts of the world that also served as inspiration for the modern-day vampire, like the Vetala, which is from Indian Hindu folklore. It's said to be a ghoulish trickster that hangs around cemeteries. They hang upside down from trees, like bats, one of the known attributes attached to vampires today, but were also said to be omniscient and could literally see everything, including past, present, and future. Probably one of the most disturbing creatures by appearance that I came across was the Penanggalan. Sorry if I didn't say that right. It basically means to detach or remove, and that will make a lot more sense when you see the depiction of this monstrosity. It's an exclusively female entity that walks around just like everyone else during the day, but at nighttime they transform and become nothing but a head with a spinal column along with some entrails. It sounds a lot like a myth that was created to describe the problems that can occur with childbirth, because it's said to prey upon pregnant women and newborn children. When a woman would give birth, they supposedly would hide outside and send in its invisible straw-like tongue through the window to drain off blood from the new mother. They were said to keep big vats of vinegar inside of their homes, and after a night of harassing mothers and babies, would soak their organs in the vinegar in order to shrink them back down so they could fit into their bodies again. I found this legend to be so fascinating though, because I had never heard of it a single time in my life, and it's pretty horrifying to consider such a thing stalking you during an already stressful time. Now, there are a lot more mentions of vampires from other cultures, but I just don't have enough time to go over every single one of them. Most of them could use their own video, just like some of the stories I've come across about vampires that could too. Everything I've collected over the past months while researching has been incredibly interesting though, and as I mentioned already, there's going to be a lot of addendums added to this vampire file of the Cryptic Archive. It's a very rich topic, and I don't feel I'd be doing it justice by trying to cram everything into a single video. This does work as a good summary though, and it touches on the literature and the local legends that came together to shape the image of the vampire that we know today. Just realize that there is no one-size-fits-all here. The vampire is a collection of different myths with the creative embellishment of several different authors. Now that we've gone over the educational bit, we've finally arrived at my favorite part, where I like to go over relevant stories or personal accounts. In this case, I'm not going to read you some bogus story from Reddit's No Sleep, but I'm going to go over one from history in detail. One of the most curious stories I've read has to be about the vampire of Anantis. This was a tale from England, and I also found cross-pollination of a very similar story from the Celts. The story was told by a 12th century chronicler, William of Newburgh, and it's a tale about Anantis Castle. Some of you might have already heard this tale since it is often relabeled as the Alnwick Castle vampire. In 1929, an author named Montague Summers wrote a book presenting William's story, but changed a huge part of the story by changing Anantis Castle to Alnwick. I'm going to give you a summary of the story, but I'd also like to make another video specifically on this topic so I can read the entire translated text that this story came from. I think it really gives legitimacy to the actual origin of the tale instead of essentially having it just be hearsay. The book I reference is called Historia Rerum Anglicarum, or The History of English Affairs, and it was originally written in Latin. Now, according to the text, William heard this tale from an older monk who, as he said, lived in honor and authority in those parts, just to say he was a respected individual. The monk told him that he witnessed all of these events firsthand, that there was a man of evil conduct running in fear of his enemies, or perhaps the law, away from the province of York. He ended up at Anantis Castle, and the Lord allowed him to live there. He took a wife, and soon after, rumors started to spread about her infidelity. Vexed with jealousy and wanting to find out for himself if the reports were true, he told his wife he was going on a trip that he wouldn't return from for a few days. Instead of actually leaving, he came back at night and hid himself on a beam overlooking his wife's bedroom. In this way, he actually caught his wife fornicating with a young man from the neighborhood, and with anger, he must have yelled and lost his footing. He fell and hit the ground heavily, knocking himself out in the process. The young man ran off, but his wife tried to rouse her fallen husband. Once he had recovered, he scolded her for her adultery and threatened to punish her. His wife, trying to be clever, basically said he's not speaking politely and that it's not his fault, but the fault of a sickness that's taken him over. Now, given he was in such bad shape from the fall, William tells us that this man then actually came down with disease. It almost makes me wonder if he hadn't gotten a concussion, but it's not clear from the text what his symptoms were. But that's when the monk who has related the story to William visits the man and asks him to make a confession of his sins and receive the Christian Eucharist because he's not in good health. The man is too busy thinking about what has happened to him though and what his wife had said, so he decides to put it off until the next day. I feel like I might be missing something from the translation here, but it could just be that the man didn't really want to confess and brushed the monk off. But anyway, back on track. Tomorrow never comes, and the Anantis man dies overnight. The monk was kind enough to give the man a Christian burial, even though many considered him unworthy of it. It didn't do him or anyone much good though, considering he began to rise from his grave at night, followed by a pack of barking dogs. He wandered around all of the houses, and everyone stayed indoors at night, making sure their doors were tightly fastened to keep him out. Regardless of their precautions, disease filled every house and death began to take its toll on the villagers. Now, it's said that the town was quite populated, even a short time ago, and that now it seemed deserted. Those who had managed to escape destruction had moved to other parts of the country. The monk related to William that his parish was left bereft, and he was quite saddened over the loss of his congregation. So he called a meeting inviting every religious and wise man that was left in the town on Palm Sunday, and together they held a discourse with the town's remaining inhabitants with the intentions of refreshing everyone's spirits. Afterwards, the monk held a banquet inviting all of his clerical friends as well as other guests of honor, while the rest of the townspeople were left to their own devices. Two young men who had lost their father from the plague began to encourage the others to do something about this problem. One brother said, "This monster has already destroyed our father and will speedily destroy us also, unless we take steps to prevent it. Let us, therefore, do some bold action which will at once ensure our own safety and revenge our father's death. There is no one to hinder us, for in the priest's house a feast is in progress, and the whole town is as silent as if deserted. Let us dig up this baneful pest and burn it with fire." Having successfully riled up the people, the brother grabbed a shovel and led the mob to the cemetery. They dug up the man's grave and were surprised to find it was quite shallow, and that the linen burial wrap he had been wearing had been torn to shreds. The corpse had swollen to an enormous size, and the skin was red like cheeks flush with blood. The young men feared not, and stabbed the carcass with a weapon from which a stream of blood flowed. William says directly from the text that it might have been taken for a leech filled with the blood of many persons. They dragged the carcass away from the village and set up a funeral pyre. Someone there mentioned that the body would not burn unless its heart were torn out, and so after several blows to the corpse's ribcage with the shovel, one man was finally able to thrust into his chest and rip out his heart. They tore it apart and then set the body on fire. Now, you might think that all of this sounds like a lot of superstitious nonsense. I won't deny the thought had crossed my mind several times throughout the tale. But as soon as the body has finished burning, William says, when that infernal hellhound had thus been destroyed, the pestilence which was rife among the people ceased, as if the air which had been corrupted by the contagious motions of the dreadful corpse were already purified by the fire which had consumed it. It is possibly coincidental that the plague the villagers had been suffering from stopped, the moment this man had been burned, thus seeming to cleanse their village, or maybe it had already stopped. It could be that they blamed this man because he was new to town as well and not well trusted. Given there isn't much detail about the disease that the villager suffered from though, it's really hard to say one way or another. I can say that it's highly likely that there was nothing strange about the way they found his body. It sounds as though it were in a normal state of decay, but I would need to know how many days it had been since he were buried. The body can appear just this way within 8 to 10 days post-mortem, but at the same time in the story, it sounds as though it had been much longer. Imagine that many people had gotten sick, languished, and then died. Even so, for the town to seem deserted, it must have been at least a month, maybe even 2 for all of this to happen. And if that's the case, the body should have started to liquefy by then, not show the bloat typical within the first week or 2 of death. I do plan to go into more detail when I make the Anantis Castle vampire specific video, which won't be long after this release, I'm sure. Since all of the details are still fresh, William ends his account quickly by moving on to another story, as though the thought of dwelling on what might have happened there at Anantis Castle truly disturbed him. What's strange though is that there is no Anantis Castle known in England. Originally, William heard the story from a monk who said that the unnamed man ran from York, so it would have to be close, but far enough away that he could escape the law. Some speculate that it could have been the town of Annan, which is in Scotland, about 133 miles away from York. Back then the town did have a castle too, which has since fallen into ruin. Still, 133 miles is very far, even if by horseback, so it might just be that this town's name has fallen away to history. I have to say, what I enjoy most about this story, though, is that it can be traced back to an actual source. It's not hearsay, as so many of the other tales are, even if the account itself technically is. There's a lot of other stories, some of which I've heard repeated over and over, like the tale of Mercy Brown from New England, which doesn't really sound much like vampirism to me. It's been commonly touted that vampires were simply an excuse, or even a colorful metaphor for consumption, another name for tuberculosis. I'll cover that in another video if you guys are interested, but I really didn't see the need to be repetitive since almost every vampire video on YouTube mentions that story. Given the Anantis vampire story was so long, I'm just going to leave the rest of the stories I have collected for separate videos, so keep an eye out for them in the future if you find yourself as interested in vampires as I am. While it has been difficult to find news articles on other cryptids I've covered, vampires are certainly not hard to find in the news. This article even popped up right after I began my search. It's titled, "Medieval Vampire Unearthed with Sickle Across Her Throat to Stop Her Rising from the Dead." This is describing a skeleton found at an archaeological dig, unearthing a 17th century cemetery in the village of Upyr, Poland. There are several factors that make this article more interesting than others I've seen in the same vein. One thing is that she was found with a silk cap on her head, which was a mark of high social status, meaning she was likely from a wealthy family. She also had a very strange protruding tooth where it seems like the root was actually growing over her gums for some reason. She was found with the sickle placed over her throat so that if she attempted to get up after death, she'd severely injure herself, and oddly enough, there was a padlock attached to one of her toes as well. There's another good article from out of Poland, dated back to 2013, from National Geographic. This was very cool because they found a skeleton buried with the head removed from the neck and placed between the legs. Do you remember me telling you about how they did the same thing with the Slavic Upyr? Poland was very close to the origination of many of these vampire legends, being just north of Romania and not far west from Russia. So it's amazing to see how vampire preventative measures traveled. The article also mentions a male skeleton found on the Greek island of Lesbos, whose body had been staked to the ground by several 8-inch long iron spikes through the neck, pelvis, and ankle. They didn't find anything different about the state of his skeleton, but whoever he was, the locals sure didn't want him to come back. Now we get to the video evidence portion, and I have to say, I'm not confident that I'm going to find anything that isn't some normal person that says they're a vampire and need blood to survive, like this guy. I'm not gonna lie, the hunt for good vampire proof was a huge disappointment. Most of the clips I found are obvious fakes.
What the hell?
A lot of clips I found seem to rely on superhuman speed as a vampire ability too, but if you're being technical about it, couldn't I just as easily use the same clip as proof of real-life superheroes? Still, I'll show you a couple of the more compelling ones I found. I did find this one, which, while it certainly doesn't show irrefutable proof that this is a vampire, is definitely a bit strange.
Of course. I know, he's gonna freak out. Wait, I don't know. Okay, so I don't know what you're saying. You're filming the guy that stole it? No, look, just keep watching. It's crazy. Wait, I know. What? I know. Like, how is that? I don't know. What?
I'm not a video expert by any means, but I don't notice any clips or blips in the footage either before or during the portion where the man crosses the mirror. It is suspicious that one of the people watching the CCTV footage puts their finger right in front of the timestamp though, at just the moment he passes by. Still, I can't catch anything in the background that tells me that at some point this switches to a green screen or any masking filter to hide this man's image from the mirror. I'm still hunting for something really good though, something that actually looks like real footage instead of just neatly produced film. So by all means, if you find anything that could be real, send it my way. So this has been a huge amount of information to digest and dump, and I have barely touched the surface. Wrapping this up, I find it difficult to come to a conclusion as to whether or not vampires actually existed or still exist to this day. I believe that for the most part, vampires are fictional. In many cases, it seems quite obvious that people were spurred on by fear and desperation to believe in them and to desecrate the bodies of the dead as a hopes to survive. Especially when sickness was involved, some people might not have even been in their right minds. It makes total sense that the Penanggalan would be created as an explanation for the death of women during childbirth or the death of newborns. It would have been excruciating to cope with that on a regular basis given the lack of medical understanding for surgery and even avoiding infections, but it's still weird to come up with something so far-fetched. I mean, a floating head with a spinal column and some organs? How do you think that one ever came to fruition without someone actually seeing it? And then that so many people would believe it? It's quite strange, isn't it? There's also consumption to consider, as well as vampires that were said to attack a whole family. It makes sense because back then a family would live together entirely, several generations worth in one household, and so if one person got sick and died, it was probably very likely that they would all get sick and that lots of them would die. Perhaps in those situations, the vampire was just an excuse, the explanation of a dying sick mind to maybe take back some control over their life by staking their dead relatives in the hopes that it might save them. At the same time, even while many of the tales sound superstitious and not very well supported in terms of actual proof, it does make you wonder how the tale came to be in the first place. It seems that the tales mostly originated from the Slavic regions though, and thus I would say that's probably where they hold the most likelihood of being true, or at least something close to it. To be fair though, I think this topic needs far more research before I can come to any absolute conclusions. I need to find more accounts, actual texts, and books, and make my decision from there. It's crazy to think that I've spent about 2 months already studying the topic of vampires, and I have learned so much, and yet there's still a lot more to go over. I mean, I barely scraped the surface here. I do have one thing that is worth mentioning though that might speak to the possibility of vampires existing. It's very slim, but an observation nonetheless. When I first started looking into vampires, it was like a broken record of the same YouTube videos over and over. Usually when I first start looking into a topic, I'll listen to a ton of videos and soak them in while doing another activity, like painting for instance. Afterwards, I move on to more thorough research, looking up sources and books and whatnot. In this case though, I found that everyone was talking about the very same things. It was either the truth behind Dracula in one variation or another, sort of debunking the modern idea of the vampires compared to the older version, and they usually would go into great detail about Vlad Tepes. Then there was the constant reiteration of certain stories. One was Mercy Brown, as I mentioned earlier. Another was the story of a Connecticut skeleton found, dubbed JB, whose body had been rearranged in his grave, very likely because he was suspected of being a vampire. Some people brought up other topics. Occasionally I'd hear someone mention Elizabeth Bathory, who was said to bathe in blood, but it was really quite a weak selection. Ultimately, I had to dig into the names of vampires by region. I bought about 5 different books, of which I'll leave in the description, the ones that I used for this video. After much searching, I finally started to find more information, more legends, but it was not easy to get there. I had to really work for it. Call me paranoid, but it actually made me feel like it was being kept under wraps intentionally. Why was the same repetitive junk showing up over and over? Why was it necessary to dig into the vampire names from each region just to find anything more in depth in search engines? And what's more is, why do the stories that do show up focus so much on the very obvious bias that vampires don't exist? Are we here to show the data and let our viewers make the choice? Or are we here to prove it's just superstition and false? I personally like to hold on to a healthy combination of the two perspectives and let you decide for yourself. So what do you think about vampires? Are they superstitious myths? Something extreme to explain a misunderstood situation or disease? Is there any fragment of truth to their existence? Have you ever encountered a vampire, or perhaps heard a unique story from a friend or a relative? I'd love to hear your thoughts and any personal experiences you might have had in the comments below. If you have a longer story you'd like to share with me, send it to my email at me@crypticarchive.com. Please subscribe to the channel for more vampire videos because I plan to make addendums to the file for many, many different stories that I've come across. We're talking suspected real-life vampires like the Carter brothers and Elizabeth Bathory, as well as vampire legends like the Anantis Castle vampire tale I mentioned in this video. There's also the piles and piles of literature and all of the different mythos to go over. I've never had any personal experiences with vampires myself, but I've always been enchanted with the idea of the more civilized versions as depicted in Interview with the Vampire, for instance. I've always been a night owl too. Seriously, I don't get to bed until 4 a.m. most nights. And I have thick sun-blocking curtains over my windows just so I can sleep most of the morning away. So I guess I've always felt a strange kinship in that regard, but that's about where the similarities end. I have many other stories about personal and paranormal experiences I've dealt with over on my Patreon though, so please consider signing up if you're interested in hearing about them. It really helps me to keep the channel going too, considering starting out is notoriously difficult on YouTube. Every time I post a new video here, I post a new video on Patreon as well. So definitely check it out if you're interested in supporting the channel. The Patreon link is in the info below, and you can pledge any amount you desire. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and share the video if you've enjoyed it. This one doesn't fit quite right into the cryptid category, and I'm not really sure it's fully paranormal either. Ultimately, I decided to make a new folder entirely and will be sorting it into my Undead file. Entry number 0004 on vampires complete.